Hello again, my name is Steve Hillis and this is the last in our series of videos on crime patterns and trends. Here we're looking at seasonal variations in crime. The graph on the top is showing seasonal patterns, distributions of violent crime across different months. And if you look carefully, you can see that violent crimes tend to peak in the summer months. Generally, a lot of times, criminals who are out robbing and assaulting and so forth are out on the street. And they tend to stay inside and not engage in street crime and not engage in a lot of violent crime during bad weather, during colder months like January and February. So crime rates, especially violent crime rates, tend to be lower during those periods. Now there are exceptions to that general rule. For example, during winter months you often see higher rates of domestic violence. On the other hand, you tend to see less crime on the streets. And generally, colder months, winter months, late fall months tend to have the lowest crime rates. On the other hand, crime rates tend to go up during spring and especially during summer. You see a similar pattern with property crime. Although, you've got to be careful, right in the period right after Christmas and right actually before Christmas, although you can't see it on this graph, you do tend to get a spike in property crime rates. But otherwise, it's a very, very similar pattern to what you see here with violent crimes earlier. Once again, people tend to commit more property crimes during warmer weather, during nicer weather, summer and late spring months, early fall. Less so in winter and late fall. Now again, I made the point that crime tends to vary according to temperature and more generally towards weather. Here we see the relationship between temperature and crime, with crime peaking out in the mid-80s, say 85 degrees. As temperatures rise way into the high 80s, 90s and above, crime rates tend to fall. And again, as temperatures get really cool, especially very cold weather, once again, crime rates tend to fall. Look, criminals are pretty much like everyone else. A lot of predatory criminals, for example, just don't like going out and fighting the rain, the sleet, the ice, or for that matter, sweating their tails off trying to rob people on the street. In essence, they stay inside to get air conditioning or heat when the weather's bad, just like everyone else. It's more than that, of course. Some of it is that they're less likely to be on the street because their victims are less likely to be on the street. They're less likely to go out and rob people when it's extremely hot or extremely cold because there aren't that many people to be robbed. They're in their houses. They're staying inside. So for these reasons and others, you tend to get these kinds of temperature relationships. Now, there's other kinds of trends and patterns when it comes to crime. In this case, we're going to talk a little bit more about location. Actually, we haven't mentioned it yet, so let's talk about it now. The geography of crime. Crime rates vary considerably across different kinds of areas. Here we're seeing violent crime rates broken down by metropolitan areas, large metropolitan areas, other cities, smaller cities, and rural areas. You'll notice that violent crime rates are quite a bit higher in larger cities than they are in smaller cities, and the smaller cities have higher violent crime rates in rural areas. Now with property crimes, you see a similar relationship. But, at least for this 2006 UCR data, we see that medium-sized cities and below tend to have property crime rates that are actually a little higher than our larger metropolitan areas, but still the lowest property crime rates by far are found in rural areas. Generally speaking, really small towns and rural areas tend to have low crime rates. That's especially true for violent crime, but it's also true for property crime as well. And again, you see that same kind of thing here, but here we have it broken down by city size, and we're looking at robbery rates. Robbery, by the way, is a crime that's especially concentrated in big urban areas, and you can see that here. With cities over 250,000 in population, they have robbery rates that are vastly higher than much smaller cities with populations of 50 to slightly under 100,000. And then if you look at rural counties, armed robbery and other forms of robbery tend to fall way down. So, some crimes like robbery, tend to be distributed very unevenly across different kinds of areas in terms of cities, urban areas, and rural areas. Here, since we're talking about robbery rates, we can kind of also mention a little bit about how these robbery victimization rates vary by some of the things we talked about earlier, by race, ethnicity, gender. How race and gender interact to determine who's the most likely to be robbed. How your age determines or influences your probability of being robbed. And finally, your income. Now just take this as a review. Again, robbery is very much an urban crime, but very much like the other crimes we talked about earlier, you see large racial differences, with African Americans being more likely to be victims of robbery than whites or others. You see differences between different ethnic groups, Latinos being more likely to be victims of robbery than non-Latinos. You see that men are well over twice as likely to be robbed compared to women. But also notice that race and gender interact in powerful ways. African American males are far more likely, to be robbed compared to African American females, who are actually a little less likely to be robbed than white males. And finally, white females are actually the least likely to be robbed. So it's not just your race or just your gender. It's how the two things combine to influence how likely you are to be a victim of these crimes that occur predominantly in large cities. Younger people are more likely to be victims of robbery, especially those 16 to 19, to a lesser degree 20 to 24, than people who are older. And once again, notice people who are 50 to 64, pretty low odds of being robbed. People 65 and older, again, very low rates of robbery in that age bracket. And you'll find that people who have low incomes are more likely to be victims of robbery, as opposed to people with higher incomes. Although, once again, you'll notice that it begins to kind of go up a little bit when you reach the higher levels of income. Maybe because people with higher incomes simply have more to steal. So maybe robbers more actively pursue them. For whatever reason, at the higher income levels, there's a slight increase. But the general tendency is for victimization rates to decline pretty substantially as your income rises. But again, let's not get too far afield in talking about a robbery broken down by these various socio-demographic characteristics. The point here is to talk more about the geography of crime. Here we're looking at the number of homicides per 100,000 for different cities in the mid-2000s. And at that time, Detroit was having, well, a little bit of a violent crime nightmare. By the way, they still are. Some of the other cities that had very high crime rates were cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Memphis, and all the way over to Chicago and Phoenix. By the way, as this video is being recorded, there's been a change in some of the crime patterns over the last few years. In cities like Chicago, unfortunately, have jumped way towards the front. They're having some very serious problems with youth violence and gang violence, gun violence, and so forth, which has led to a pretty rapid explosion in homicides in Chicago. The point here isn't to focus on specifically which city has the highest homicide rates or the highest rates of violent crime. The point is to point out that there is tremendous variation across large cities. And some cities actually have very low crime rates, very low violent crime rates. For example, you'll notice our largest city, New York City, doesn't even make the list here. And the reason is if you look at the number of homicides per 100,000 in New York, it's surprisingly low, even though it's such a large city. So, while larger cities tend to have higher rates of violent crime, it isn't always the case. More generally, you get quite a bit of variation in crime in general, and violent crime in specific, across cities. Here we see the top 10 homicide rates among largest cities in the United States. I'm reading that again, and obviously screwing up. And I will point out as well, to kind of Well, make a point we made earlier that homicide rates have been dropping precipitously over this period. And by the way, a lot of this decline in crime rates, or I should say homicide rates, has been driven by reduced levels of violent crime and reduced levels of homicides in large cities. Even though some large cities continue to have huge problems with murders and homicide, or with murders and violent crime, the general trend has been for larger cities in the United States actually to get safer. So that's actually good news. Now, it isn't just when we're talking about geographic variations in crime. We can talk about broader regions, not just differences between rural and urban areas, but between different areas of the country more generally. As we look around the country, we find that some areas, especially the American South, tend to have high crime rates. The American South has substantially higher property crime rates and violent crime rates than other parts of the country. You can see that by looking at this data from 2005. The same general truth would hold today. Perhaps surprisingly, the lowest rates of violent crime and property crime were found in the American Northeast. The Midwest and the West Coast are somewhere in between. So, higher crime rates in the American South, the lowest crime rates in the American Northeast, and finally, intermediate levels of crime in the Midwest and the West. You can see a little different breakdown here on this map showing the breakdown of the risk of violent crime across the United States. All I want to point out is once you see the picture a little clearer, once you look at the map where it's broken down in a little finer grids, you begin to notice that, well, it isn't just that you have entire regions that have very different crime rates. Well, you have specific areas within particular states that tend to have lots of crime. For example, crime rates in Arizona are not distributed equally. These are areas that tend to have very high rates of violent crime, much higher than other parts of the country, for that matter, much higher than other parts of Arizona. You'll notice that crime is distributed very unequally in California. And more generally, you'll notice little blotches all over the place, many times urban areas, but sometimes rural areas, for example, in the American South, that tend to have very high rates of violent crime. Crime is distributed very unequally across the map. By the way, that's true for a lot of social statistics, but it's certainly true for crime. Now, one more topic in terms of broad crime trends and patterns. We started out this lecture series talking about a crime clock. I'd like to leave this lecture series by pointing out one more crime pattern, and that's a temporal pattern. How crime varies according to the time of the day. You can look at the clock and kind of get a sense of what types of crime will be very high and what types of crime will be very low, depending on what time of day it is. So, for example, in the mid-morning, early afternoon, you tend to get a lot of burglaries. Why? Well, that's when people aren't home. Burglars aren't that dumb. They try to burglarize houses when people aren't home, when people are at school, they're working, and so forth, when property is unprotected. So that's when you tend to get the highest rate of residential burglaries. On the other hand, if you're looking for crimes like assault, well, those are crimes that tend to happen more at night. People are out, people are on the street, people are drinking. People are around each other and sometimes get in confrontations, fights, and so forth. For the same reason, you tend to get lots of robberies during night hours. People are out on the street, they're engaged in crime, they're drunk, they're buying drugs, or simply they're walking around with money in their pockets. They're potential victims ready to be fleeced of their money. The larger point, though, is that if you look at the clock, you'll get a really good sense of what kinds of crime are most or least likely for that time of day. Crime has a pulse. Crime has a rhythm. It varies by the time of day. In fact, if you look at crime in the bigger picture, crime has all sorts of patterns and structures, all sorts of tendencies. We've just covered a few of them. I'm going to leave it to you to kind of play around with the ideas and see if you can think of a few more possible trends, patterns, and so forth when it comes to crime. This concludes our lecture series on crime patterns and trends, and we'll have another series of lectures on crime statistics. where they come from, what kinds of crime statistics are used to study crime by criminologists and sociologists and so forth. But we'll pick that one up in our next video. Thank you very much.